Whew. Okay. Let's get started. So welcome back, everyone. It's good to see you guys. We're going to be going into Acts chapter 2. Hope you watched my video on Acts chapter 1. This chapter is going to be awesome. I have some really good stuff that I want to tell you guys, unpack some things for you. So if you haven't read Acts chapter 2 yet, I want you to pause this video and read it. Okay, now that you've read the chapter, let's dive into it. So from the first verse, we see that when the day of Pentecost had fully come, this is in verse 1, they were all with one accord in one place. In verse 2, when suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Now there are two things that I want to point out here. I know we always imagine when the Holy Spirit fell that they were all in the upper room in one house. I know that's everyone's traditional understanding of this verse, of this passage, but I'm going to give a little bit of a different spin on this, because if we really unpack it and look at the Greek words that are used here, it may not be that case. It's very possible that they just weren't all in one room on the second floor of a house, because it never says that. It says that they were all with one accord in one place. It does not say house, it says in one place, and that could mean anywhere. Now, the fact that it was the day of Pentecost highly suggests that they were at the temple. And then it says, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Now here in English it uses the word house, but the Greek word for that is oikos, and oikos does not necessarily mean house. It depends on the context in which you use it. Now I'm using the New King James Version, and they assume that it was a house because that's typically how, depending on the context, that's how oikos is used. It's used for the word house, but it's not stuck to that meaning. Depending on the context, it could mean place, it could mean a location. And so if we read it like this, and it filled the whole spot or the whole area where they were sitting, that brings a whole different view to this entire chapter. And so I'm just going to unpack Pentecost first. So what is Pentecost? I know as evangelicals we understand Pentecost as the Holy Spirit day is when the Holy Spirit fell, and you're right, but it was first a Jewish festival. It was a Jewish holiday called Shavuot. I hope I said that right, Shavuot. And that was known as the Feast of Weeks, or it was like the Feast of First Fruits. It was a harvest festival for the year. It was the time where the children of Israel harvested their grain and they got all their food together and they celebrated that. And so it was called the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. So Pentecost is not a strictly evangelical word. It's like more of a Romanized or Greekified version of Shavuot. And the Feast of Weeks was one of the three Jewish pilgrimage festivals where everyone, all Jewish observers, everyone who observed Judaism would come and celebrate at Jerusalem. So the name of those three pilgrimage festivals is first the Passover, then Pentecost, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. And these were all Jewish pilgrimage festivals where it was typical for a Jewish person who was living away from Jerusalem to come back home and celebrate that festival at Jerusalem. And it was also known for the Hellenists. Now, if you remember in my last chapter, I kind of described what a Hellenist was. A Hellenist is a Greek or Gentile who converted to Judaism. And so we have people from all over the Roman Empire, all over that Mesopotamian area coming to Jerusalem. All the Jewish observers, the Judaistic practicers, they would come to Jerusalem and celebrate the Feast of Weeks, or celebrate Pentecost. So that's why we have all these different people groups there when the Holy Spirit falls. And so they're all in one place, and I want to assume that they were at the tabernacle. And if you follow along with my thinking here, you'll understand why. And so we see the Holy Spirit fall, fire fell, and it didn't burn them. This is equivalent to Moses' fire when God was talking to Moses through the burning bush. It says that Moses reached his hand into the bush and it did not burn him. In the same way, when the Holy Spirit falls, it doesn't physically burn you, but it sets a fire inside of you and it empowers you to do God's will. And so you see the similarities there. And it says that all were filled with the Holy Spirit and they began to speak in tongues or in other languages. The Greek word there is glossia, or our technical term glossolalia. They began to speak in other tongues that they did not know. When this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused because everyone heard them speak in his own language. Now, just think about it for a second. If you're on the top floor in a small house, in a small room, and everyone starts speaking in tongues, are thousands of people going to hear it? Or a lot of people can hear that? No, probably people who are walking by in the vicinity are going to hear it, and they're going to be drawn to it. But just think, if they're in the midst of thousands of people at the temple during this festival, and all of a sudden at the temple the Holy Spirit falls on this group of believers, now it makes sense why so many people heard this sound. It said they heard the sound. They heard when the rushing mighty wind came. They heard when they started speaking in tongues. This was all very clearly demonstrated. And then it says in verse 7, then they were all amazed and marveled, saying to one another, look, are not all these who speak Galileans? How in the world would they see them if they were still in the upper room? If they were in that upper room in a closed environment? No, I really think that they were at the temple, and that's when the Holy Spirit fell. And so the sound occurred, it drew a crowd, and they heard their own languages being spoken. You can't do that in an enclosed room. You won't draw a crowd like that. But when you're in the midst of thousands, that's when it happens. And then Peter gets up and starts preaching the gospel, and he starts talking about the prophecy that Joel gave of how God would send his Spirit upon his sons and daughters. And then he gives the gospel and supporting it through Old Testament evidence and Old Testament prophecy. And it says at the end of his gospel presentation that people were convicted or pierced to the heart by what they had heard. So when you give the gospel correctly, it pricks people, it pierces them to the heart, it pierces them to the soul about what they hear. And so knowing the gospel, knowing how to present it right is a valuable tool in spreading the gospel. And then because of that, 3,000 people were added to them that day. 3,000 people. Think about that. This is the first formation of the church in Jerusalem, and it is the first known megachurch. 3,000, bam, added to the disciples, and they have to take care of these 3,000 people. And so we go on and we look at, well, what did they do to facilitate these 3,000 people? And this is what they said. They continued in the apostles' doctrine, with fellowship, eating together, and prayer, or breaking bread together and with prayer. And this is how they assimilated these 3,000 new believers. And it says at the end that they gained favor in their community, and God added to their family daily. Now also the day regarding Pentecost, that was the day that God gave the law to Moses, and Moses gave it to the children of Israel. So Pentecost also commemorates the day that the law was given to the children of Israel. Now just think about that for a second, that the same day that the law was given to the children of Israel, that same day, many years later, God gave his Spirit to his children, whoever believes in him. Just an amazing contrast that you see there. And where when the law was given, if you want to look this up, it's in Exodus, when the law was given, 3,000 people died. When the Spirit was given on that same day, 3,000 people were saved. It's just an amazing contrast to look at, that we're no longer under the heavy burden of the law of the Old Testament, but now we get to live by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. So I hope this blessed you guys. Keep on thinking, and we're going to be going into Acts chapter 3. Let's discuss it with ourselves and see where we get to. We'll see you guys later. Bye.